Evolutionary changes in populations. Any variation which is not inherited is unimportant to us. Charles Darwin. For evolution to occur, there must be an inheritable mutation. Microevolution versus macroevolution. Changes to a population versus creation of a new species. Part 2. It all starts with microevolution along with isolation. How do species form? There are approximately 13 to 14 million different species currently alive today. Maybe even more. It's really hard to say. In particular, the arthropods, scientists feel that they've only possibly found about 70% of what might actually be out there. So this number could be a lot different. So what do we mean when we talk about a new species or a species in general? A member of a population capable of interbreeding in nature to produce fertile offspring and do not interbreed successfully or naturally with members of other species. That's what our current definition of species is. However, we do know that the corners of this definition are fuzzy because there are hybrids and hybrid zones that have been identified where two different species do produce hybrids in this little area where there is some overlap, and that some of those hybrids are capable of reproducing, but usually don't. And that only happens when there is large amounts of populations or extremely small amounts of populations, and it's difficult to find a mate of your own species. Within species, there does exist, however, different races, and races are a term that we normally apply to humans, but it can be applied to any species out there. A race is basically just a group of individuals or a subspecies that share similar traits. Groups in a population are undergoing evolution in order to become a new species. So that's exactly what a race is. It's just a group of individuals that have been isolated. They have their own set of traits. They're different from others within that population, either the parent population or you have the whole species is small groups of populations, each undergoing its own evolutionary pathway. Should those populations stay separate from each other for long enough, eventually they'll become their own species. So the things that affect microevolution also affect or bring about changes in macroevolution. So that includes, again, mutation, which we know is occurring all the time, gene flow, which is the movement of alleles from one population to another. Gene flow primarily ends up with immigration and emigration. Genetic drift, this is where you have a chance alteration in gene frequencies in a population. You see it most strongly when the populations are small. Can also occur due to the founder effect or due to some sort of bottlenecking effect. Non-random mating occurs when one member of a population is not likely to mate with another. So usually these are species that have extremely long and complicated mating rituals. And finally, the one that Darwin was most favored with is natural selection, where individuals with traits that are more favorable tend to have more offspring. Those with bad traits tend to be eliminated from a population. These 5 things have to be occurring along with one other thing to create a new population or a new species, and that is isolation. Isolation is the key. So if a population becomes isolated for any reason, and isolation can occur in many different ways, they will begin to move along their own evolutionary pathway because their gene pool now becomes something that's isolated from another gene pool. Mutations that are occurring in one gene pool are not shared with another. Over time, they become more and more genetically different, until they are their own separate species. So let's look at how a population becomes isolated, or a group can become isolated. And there's different types of isolation. All we have to do is prevent reproduction from taking place. So that can also be with habitat isolation. Basically, they live in different places, they don't meet each other, and I mean, they can be even in the same area. You can have a pill bug that spends his life under one log his entire life and never meets the pill bugs that are under the log 10 feet away from him. That's habitat isolation. You can also have temporal isolation, where the various times of the year when the individuals are ready to mate and ready for reproduction don't match up with each other. When one's ready, the other one's not. When the other one's ready, the first one is not. You can also have behavior isolation. This is what you see with birds in particular. The song isn't perfect. The dance isn't perfect. And if it's not perfect, then reproduction is not going to happen between those two individuals. You can also have mechanical isolation, where the individuals physically just don't fit with each other, and so it prevents reproduction from occurring. And finally, gametic isolation. Gametic isolation is where conception does take place, but in the zygote itself begins to fall apart, because in order for that zygote to start developing, when the sperm and egg come together, they don't form or don't have the exact right pairing of chromosomes, and therefore they can't do mitosis from that point on, or the cells themselves don't survive. You can also have isolation coming with post-zygotic. So this is after conception. So let's say conception does take place and an individual is created. However, you can have hybrid inviability, hybrid sterility, or hybrid breakdown. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So let's look at some of these mechanisms a little bit closer. So let's say that you have two individuals that are living in the same spot. So let's say you've got a group of birds that live in Costa Rica. A huge storm comes up, and all of a sudden, a huge number of these birds are caught in the air, and they are pulled by the storm onto an island. That island is so far away that these birds can't fly back to the mainland where they originally from. They then stay at that island and they interbreed and they go on their own evolutionary pathway. The ones on the mainland proceed on their own evolutionary pathway. Now, a whole 100 years, 1,000 years later, the two populations meet up again, and they're so different now from each other that they either don't behave the same, they mechanically can't be the same, temporally they're not the same, and so they're permanently isolated from each other. You can also have ecological isolation. So even if they live in the same area, even in the same ecosystem, they don't end up coming in contact with each other because of the niches where they live. One lives in the canopy, the other one lives on the ground. One lives in the soil, the other one lives in a rotting tree. So there's a lot of things that can happen there. Temporal isolation, there's a group of frogs in Florida where if you look at them, you would never know that they're actually different species, and scientists didn't realize that they weren't different species. They are identical to each other in how they look, and even in a laboratory setting, you can force these two to mate with each other. However, in the wild, they breed at two completely different times throughout the year, and therefore they would be considered to be their own species. Post-zygotic barriers, hybrid inviability, that occurs when the zygote dies before reaching maturity. So the gametes are able to match up, the chromosomes are able to match up, the cells divide. However, the hybrid itself, once it either dies before it's born or after it's born, it's weak and it cannot survive or doesn't survive, at least to the point where it might become reproductively mature. You also have hybrid sterility, where the individual does become reproductively mature. However, when gametes are being formed inside that hybrid's body using meiosis, it can't really form a viable egg or sperm, and therefore the hybrid is sterile. Or, finally, the hybrid isn't sterile. It's able to mate with another hybrid or even another from either population. However, over time, the hybrid begins to break down. Individuals, the descendants of that hybrid, become weak due to hybrid inviability or even become sterile due to hybrid sterility. At any rate, there's no prolonged generations of the hybrid. When isolation is successful and these individuals or populations do go on their own evolutionary pathway, we call that speciation. And there are different types of speciation that are defined. The first one is allopatric. That's where a physical barrier separates the populations. Sympatric means that the new species is developing in the same region as the parent, and it's primarily due to polymorphisms within the population, along with natural selection. Parapatric, a new niche is found adjacent to the original one, so again, it's somewhat sympatric or similar to sympatric, but in this case, a niche is completely different. Or you have peripatric, where you have a new niche that then isolates the population that takes advantage of that new niche from the original parent population, and you get the founder's effect within that small population. So, if I have individuals and they become separated from each other for long term or long enough, and how long is long? It really just depends on the species themselves. Sometimes a couple weeks could be long enough for fruit flies. However, something like humans, for example, humans and hominids, it may take 10,000 years before you see allopatric speciation. Because these individuals, these populations become separated from each other, what you end up seeing is an exaggeration of either genetic drift or the founder's effect in these populations, because usually when they're split off, they're small enough that these two mechanisms really have a high effect. But basically, when the barrier is removed, the populations are unable to reproduce with each other. They're significantly different and now isolated from each other. Sympatric speciation occurs when the speciation is happening right at within the parent population. So within all populations, you have different polymorphisms, and that's just a fancy word for individuals with different traits. Now, should the environment choose one trait over another, or should one niche choose one trait over another, then you might see individuals become successful in one area, and they break off from the parent population, and those particular polymorphisms, those particular selected traits become more and more functional in that small population, and eventually in time you see a new species being formed. Sympatric speciation is the explanation for why we do have so many different plants out there. One of the things that plants are capable of doing is they can handle polyploidy, which is basically having multiple versions of the same chromosome. Mammals can't, and animals don't handle that very well, but plants do. So what you can have is when gametes form, instead of the gametes forming properly, which would be going from a diploid to a haploid, the gametes themselves, the meiosis doesn't work out, and the number of chromosomes don't divide. They don't get pulled apart normally, creating those haploid gametes. The gametes themselves are diploid, and they might meet up with another diploid gamete, forming a completely new species with double the chromosomes of the parent population. That can happen over and over and over again. And if you look at many different plants out there in the wild today, and the ones that we cultivate, polyploidy is one of the explanations why there are so many that are somewhat similar to each other. Wheat is a common example of one. In animals, sympatric speciation, you see this primarily in areas where there's many niches within that habitat. So you have a group of individuals, each has their own traits, and then you have some selective process. It could be a natural selection process. It could be a reproductive selection process, a behavioral selective process. At any rate, what ends up happening is the extremes are favored over the norm, and those extremes are chosen over and over and over again until they become reproductively isolated from each other. And even if they are reunited, and you do see a hybrid zone in between individuals or populations that undergo sympatric speciation, while that speciation is occurring, while that evolutionary process is occurring, the smaller the hybrid zone, the farther apart that they are. Okay, here's just a really nice graphic that kind of helps and compare the three. Allopatric, parapatric, and sympatric. Now, parapatric and peripatric are very similar to each other. With allopatric, you see the barrier being formed, isolation occurring, new species, boom. With the sympatric, you see the polymorphisms within the population. Those polymorphisms are selected for, and now you see a new species again within that population. With parapatric and peripatric speciation, there's always a selection of some sort of new niche out there, a niche that part of the population enters, and due to polymorphisms, those individuals with parapatric are capable of taking advantage of that new niche, leaving behind the parent population in the niche that they were currently in. They grow side by side. There's lots of overlap, a huge hybrid zone. But then at some point over time, they become different enough that that hybrid zone gets smaller and smaller. With peripatric, you see the exact same thing as you do with parapatric. The only difference here is that that new niche doesn't allow the hybrid zone. That population that enters that new niche suddenly becomes completely isolated from the parent population. They grow up in their own niche and very quickly become their own species. When we look at evolution out there, one of the biggest forms of evidence that we see is fossil evidence. When you see slow changes over time, that theory of evolution is called gradualism. It became very apparent as more and more fossils were being dug up that there were times within the fossil record of just huge amounts of evolution taking place, huge changes within populations, and new populations coming up, or new different species coming up very quickly, not too quickly to be explained by gradualism. One of the things that always was the big problem with that is that fossils are not created all the time. As a matter of fact, they're really a special event to create a fossil. And so we know that lots of stuff happens that doesn't ever get preserved in the fossil record. So using the fossil record as your sole evidence is not really a good idea. You need more. But in looking at the fossil record the way it is, we don't have some of the transitional forms that you should be able to see with gradualism. Sometimes we have just rapid bursts of change where you have one type of polymorphism, and then very quickly you lead right into a second, completely different polymorphism. The guys at Harvard, Stephen Jay Gould and a number of his co-workers, came up with another theory, a potential theory for this, and that's called punctuated equilibria. So we have gradualism and you have punctuated equilibria. In punctuated equilibria, what they theorized is that there were rapid bursts of change followed by periods of stasis where nothing changed, very little evolution was happening. What's actually correct? It's really hard to say. Here's a nice graphic that shows punctuated equilibrium versus gradualism. Gradualism on the left, punctuated equilibrium on the right. So which is correct? They're both probably correct depending on the various times of year. Mutations occur at a constant pace and usually don't affect or don't lead into speciation because they're constantly happening. But if you have a mutation and you have individuals within a population that are highly different from each other, along with a severe environmental change, then you can have a rapid burst of evolutionary change. Basically, when populations are really, really stressed or close to becoming extinct, that's when they're most likely to change. That's what you see in the human evolution. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But there was a period of time when scientists theorized that there may have been only 10,000 hominids of our ancestors, the Homo sapien ancestors, alive in Africa. And they were almost ready for to become extinct. But some sort of change happened. Some sort of polymorphism happened within that group that allowed them not only to survive, but to evolve and grow to become one of the most populated species on the planet. So here is some pictures. If you look across the top, you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G. These are skulls of various ancestors of the human population and the chimpanzee population. If you look from A to G, you can see some of the changes that are happening there. The bones over the eyes, the shape of the eye socket, the shape of the cheekbones, the skull cap itself, the size of the skull. Lead that down to the next level where you have H, I, J, K, L, M, N. And if you look at the sideways, what you can see is that our brains got bigger over time. And they got bigger. Actually, the largest brain was in the Neanderthals. But then the human Homo sapiens brain is actually a little bit smaller than the Neanderthal brain. I think what ended up happening is that nature kind of overshot itself. You know, your brain already requires about 25% of all your intake of calories. For Neanderthals, whose brain was much larger than ours, that would have been more like 35% of their caloric intake went directly to fund all the needs of their brain. And that may have actually led to their downfall. But changes do occur over long periods of time. So some of the topics in macroevolution that are being discussed today is pre-adaptation, pre-existing structures, which are now being used for different purposes. So let's take a look at feathers, for example. Why did feathers evolve? Originally, the thought is that feathers may have been a great way for dinosaurs, which they do know that there was a group of feathered dinosaurs that allowed them to maintain their body temperatures much better. Another theory says that feathers eventually got selected for due to sexual selection, female choice. Let's look at the feathers, look at the dress of the male or dress of the female, and choose the one with the most elaborate dress. Were feathers evolved so that these individuals could fly? No. I think the feathers came after that. Allometric growth, required rates of change for different body parts, may lead to changes in structure. There's a lot of structures out there that may have originally evolved for one purpose, and now nature has basically redesigned them or repurposed them for another, depending on what was needed in that environment. We also look at adaptive radiation and extinction. So let's just take a look at these. Adaptive radiation is the diversification of one individual into many different species, and this is basically what you see all over the world. Occurs when individuals move into some sort of new adaptive zone, new ecological niche, and here's where we see really natural selection come into play. Those individuals with the better traits are more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce. Those with bad traits are immediately eliminated from the population. And as we move into all these new different niches, one mutation that may have been negative in one environment could be the thing that lets you succeed in this new environment, or the thing that helped you succeed in your previous environment doesn't help you at all and is, a matter of fact, a hindrance in the new environment. There are many or much fossil information where you see periods where there is environmental change and extinction of one form leading to a new adaptive form. Extinction has a big effect on evolution. And there's really two different types of extinction that we talk about. And the difference between them is the rate at which they occur. There is always background extinction. There are always species that are becoming extinct. Even today, we see species becoming extinct. Their numbers are becoming low. They're specialists. Their environment's changing. They're not doing well. And humans feel that they have to save them, but the question is, should they? Extinction is a natural process. However, if one of the reasons why they're becoming extinct is due to man, then maybe we should kind of correct our mistakes. The other type of extinction that had a huge effect on evolution is mass extinctions. Now, we do know of a minimum of 5 mass extinctions that occurred on the Earth. 2 of which they're fairly positive that those occurred because some sort of meteor hit the Earth and caused a catastrophic change in the environment, which led to the demise of majority of 98% of the animals and plants that were alive at that time. What was left after the dust settled and everything was honky-dory was huge open spaces, open niches where through adaptive radiation the animals that did stay alive and the plants that did stay alive were able to capitalize and prosper. We also know of continental drift. Pangea is an area where all the land masses on the Earth were at one time connected to each other. Over time, each one of these, due to the movement of the tectonic plates, they started to move apart. Pieces of land that were not necessarily close to each other before are now close to each other, or even touching with each other. Ones that used to be close are no longer. We also know that as this whole process happened, there were new adaptive zones created and populations became isolated. So you do see on the various land masses populations of species that are related to each other, and because they're now in a new environment, they've gone on their own evolutionary pathway, they've taken on their own special traits and their special looks. In addition to that, what you see on the various land masses are populations where you see two on separate areas that actually, two species that actually look very similar to each other. And the reason why is that they occupy the same niche within a very similar environment. And therefore, what's good in one environment is also good in that other environment. And so you see that evolution taking place. So the differences between microevolution and macroevolution, there's really not that much different between them. Microevolution basically changes a population over time, and it's something that you can see and can be measured. But if a population becomes isolated for whatever reason, then macroevolution takes place. So all I need is microevolution with isolation, and I get macroevolution. Any major changes or catastrophic changes in the environment, macroevolution. Macroevolution, however, doesn't move forward without microevolution and without the microevolutionary pressures.